Hello everybody. Now today I would like to have a look at Sinéad Morrissey's poem Genetics. This is from the Poems of the Decade anthology for Edexcel English Literature A-Level. Now, as the title of this poem suggests, this is a poem about relationships, about inheritance, and about the possibility of new love and forming new relationships in the future. Now, within the poem, the speaker of the poem looks at her hands and reflects that she is a combination of DNA of both her mother and her father. Now, watch out for the extended metaphor of the hands in this poem. It is a really crucial symbol, and we will explore this further as we go on. So the speaker's parents have separated, but they are still together in her. She almost becomes the embodiment, the physical embodiment of their marriage, their union. And at the end of the poem, in the final stanza, it is addressed to a lover, an anonymous lover, as the poet thinks about the future and the possibility of starting a family of her own. So we begin then. My father's in my fingers, but my mother's in my palms. I lift them up and look at them with pleasure. I know my parents made me by my hands. So this first stanza introduces us to the symbol of the hands within this poem. The speaker quite confidently asserts that she can see her father in her fingers and her mother in her palms. She states here at the end, I know my parents made me by my hands. Her hands become a symbol for her parents' union and relationship. So the interweaving become a symbol for her identity and really her inheritance, her genetic inheritance. We also see the use of fricative alliteration within this stanza, fathers in my fingers, which further emphasises this close bond. Now they may have been repelled to separate lands, to separate hemispheres, may sleep with other lovers, but in me they touch where fingers link to palms. Now, this is what I mentioned earlier. The second stanza recognises that the speaker's parents no longer live with one another. They are no longer together. They live in separate hemispheres. They sleep with other lovers. And this second stanza really shows an awareness of how society and culture has shifted its expectations in viewing relationships. So as it says here, the narrator's parents now sleep with other lovers in separate lands. Now I'm not sure that this is actually portrayed as a negative thing. I think it's portrayed as a quite realistic aspect of modern relationships. But again, the speaker quite confidently asserts at the end of this second stanza, but in me they touch where fingers link to palms. So that in the hands, their union will remain eternal, and that the speaker herself is now that's all that's left of her parents' commitment to one another. So she becomes this embodiment of their relationship. With nothing left of their togetherness, that's the parents' togetherness, but friends who quarry for their image by a river, at least I know their marriage by my hands. Now, again, this is the speaker quite confidently asserting that she is the embodiment, and the hands become the embodiment of her parents' union. But these lines that precede it are a little bit unclear. Now, to quarry for something is to search, to dig, to pursue. And she claims that other than herself, there is nothing much left of their parents' union other than the friends that they used to share. And now these friends are left quarrying for their image by a river. Now, again, this isn't completely clear, but perhaps Morrissey is suggesting that others are still searching for their own identity and their own image, so to speak. Whereas Morrissey herself, the speaker of the poem, is quite confident in her belief that she is the genetic inheritance. She's quite confident in her kind of assimilated identity between her mother and her father. I shape a chapel where a steeple stands, and when I turn it over, my father's by my fingers, my mother's by my palms. Now, again, the hands become symbolic of the union between the narrator's parents. They are the kind of key extended metaphor of the poem. And we also get sort of quite religious imagery start to permeate the poem now. The narrator becomes almost the embodiment of their marriage, and there is an allusion to the nursery rhyme of here's the church, here's the steeple, inside are all the little people, that she has to shape this steeple and a chapel with her hands. And this is a real kind of allusion to childhood nursery rhymes, so showing that the speaker's memories are all wrapped up in the memories of her are all wrapped up with her parents' memories as well, and their parents' past, that they're all intertwined. Again, that she becomes the embodiment of their relationship. So this allusion to childhood and nursery rhymes is there to kind of pick up on that inheritance from the past. Demure before a priest reciting psalms, my body is their marriage register. I reenact their wedding with my hands. Demure means just innocent, modest, and reserved, which is kind of typical for a religious setting. And we also get this kind of continuation of the idea of the marriage ceremony, of being one flesh, of being the embodiment of their marriage. And this metaphor really pretty much spells this out very clearly. My body is their marriage register. That despite their marriage now being no more, she is the kind of sanctified document that proves that they were once together. So again, this idea of being one flesh, the idea of the speaker being the symbolic union of her mother and father. There is a clear use of personification within this stanza, showing that the narrator is the physical embodiment of their parents' marriage, despite the fact that they now sleep with other lovers. And this reenacting of the wedding with the hands, I can only presume, is a sort of interlocking of the hands, similar to the church and steeple nursery rhyme. So within the final stanza of the poem, you'll see that we see this poem take on a bit of a new direction. So take me with you, take up the skin's demands, for mirroring in bodies of the future. I'll bequeath my fingers if you bequeath your palms. We know our parents make us by our hands. Now, as you've probably noticed, in the last stanza, a new relationship is introduced into the poem, presumably that of another lover. A you is suddenly inserted and addressed by the narrator, as the narrator looks to her own future and the possibility of having a family of her own. So, while in some respects the poem is quite cyclical in its structure, this final stanza does mark a fresh chapter. As it says here, continuity and change are brought together. Now, this information in this text box here is just taken from the Edexcel poem commentaries, and all of that is available on the Edexcel website. So, this final stanza introduces a new person, a you, who is now addressed by the speaker, intimating at a possible relationship and looking towards building a family of her own. We get this quite interesting verb, bequeath, which is a legal verb. It's associated with wills, and pass. It means to kind of pass on something and hand down for others to inherit. So why this final stanza is quite interesting is that the speaker has already asserted that she is the embodiment of her parents' relationship. She has inherited their genetics. And what this final stanza points towards is her bequeathing parts of her personality and her body towards future generations. So it says, I'll bequeath my fingers if you, my lover, bequeaths your palms. So we can pass on our genetics to our future generations, to our children and beyond. So this final stanza points more widely to the kind of universal idea of inheritance and passing on genetic traits. So we do end with quite a positive image of commitment, and if you think about it, this final stanza effectively shifts this poem to a love poem. It changes it to a love poem because it ends with this partner being addressed, this unnamed partner, and points towards the idea of genetic inheritance and the possibility of making a family of her own. We also see in the final line a shift from the first person singular pronoun I to the plural we. So look at that final line. We know our parents made us by our hands. If we zoom all the way back to the first stanza, it says, I know my parents made me by my hands. So the I has changed to we, which is again another sign of a new relationship, a sign of this new togetherness that the speaker has found. And it continues what we would call the villanelle cycle. Now the villanelle is the form of this poem, which I will speak about at the end, but this introduces a very subtle change at the end of this stanza. And you'll also notice this poem was written in tercets, and in the final stanza we move into a quatrain, a more solidified unit, so to speak. So it goes from 3 lines to 4 lines to signify this sense of personal growth. Now, to discuss the form a little bit more, because the aspects of form are really quite interesting within this poem, I just wanted to point you towards, again, the Edexcel poetry commentaries that can be found on the website. And I also wanted to take a little snippet from the Hodder Guide that explains some of the aspects of syntactic parallelism that goes on in this poem. So if we look here, the type of form that we can call this is called the villanelle. It's almost like a song. It has 19 lines and quite frequent refrains, and you'll probably notice this from just reading it through. As it says here, Morrissey's choice of the villanelle expresses beautifully the dance of separation and togetherness which runs through the poem. A villanelle requires 2 repeated lines which alternate as the end line of each stanza, and the whole poem is constructed from only 2 rhymes. The parents' relationship with each other and their child is beautifully expressed by this structure, form, and meaning in the poem becoming one. The interlacing of words and rhymes suggests the complex inheritance of genetics as revealed in the narrator's hand. The villanelle is also a circular form, coming back in the final couplet to where it began. It forms a ring, echoing the imagery of marriage in the poem. Now, this is quite intense stuff. However, Morrissey use of the form is even more subtle. So we've already said that it's not an exact cycle, is it? There is use of half rhymes throughout this poem, and notice that shift in the pronoun use at the end. However, Morrissey's use of the form is even more subtle. Just as genetics doesn't result in a carbon copy of the previous generation, so the rhymes and repetitions in the poem aren't exact. The key rhyme, out of which the rest of the poem grows, is palms and hands, a half, not full rhyme. The words echo each other, as do the words mother and father. They touch both in meaning and in sound, but they are not the same. The narrator has inherited a physical likeness from both parents, but these combine to create a new individual identity. Now, this is quite complex stuff, but the key thing to take here is that what Morrissey uses is almost a bespoke, customized version of the villanelle form. So rather than using an exact full rhyme, she chooses the poem to hinge on a half rhyme of palm and hands, or palms and hands. And what the writer here is trying to explain is that this is very clever because the words are quite similar. They echo each other in terms of their meaning and sound, but they are not exact. And they are saying that this half rhyme almost reflects the idea of genetic inheritance. that although the speaker is the embodiment of her mother and father's relationship, she is not the same as them. She is not merely a carbon copy. She, as it says here, she has created a new individual identity of her own. Now, in a similar vein, the Hodder Guide also picks up on some of these aspects of form. So it says that the first and the third line of the first tercet recur alternately in the following stanzas as a refrain. So sort of like this chorus type effect. And they also form a final couplet. In a poem in which the poet is trying to negotiate with her own personal past, it is perhaps appropriate that it is located in a traditional historical form. So the villanelle is a very old, historical, traditional type of poetry. And what the writer here is trying to say that since this is a poem where the speaker has to dig and search into her own past, it is quite fitting that this poem is written in a very traditional and historical poetical form. Morrissey has also said that the form of the villanelle is the poetic equivalent of the double helix of DNA. The form certainly creates a mantra-like effect. So again, linking back to that almost chorus repetition, an incantation almost, as if as the poet keeps returning to the same ideas. Remember, always returning back to that extended metaphor of the hands. The weaving lines and the alternating refrain echo the process of union, duplication and separation that the poem describes, the inheritance of genetic codes replicated in the speaker's hands. Of course, Morrissey adapts the form. Now, I mentioned this. She customizes and adapts her own villanelle form. The central rhyme, as we've said, is based on palms and hands, which is a half rhyme. The refrains are merely similar, not complete copies. I know my parents made me by my hands progresses to at least I know their marriage by my hands. The speaker is not a complete copy of her parents either. So, although we said that the speaker in this poem is keen to stress that she is the embodiment, she is the marriage register of her parents, she is the physical embodiment of her parents' union, the subtle shifts in rhyme, using a half rhyme rather than a full rhyme, kind of hints towards the fact that as genetics are inherited, you do not just become a carbon copy of your mother and your father. You may be the kind of embodiment of their marriage, their relationship, but you are your own new individual identity. The syntax, now syntax means word order. The syntax of genetics is also noteworthy. Morrissey makes distinctive use of syntactic parallelism in the poem. Now, syntactic parallelism is where word order is repeated throughout a poem. The word, like the structure of sentences, are duplicated and repeated. So if we look at the opening line of the poem, my father's in my fingers, but my mother's in my palms, you can see here that these two clauses are the same. The structure of the two clauses is the same, but the vocabulary has changed. Okay, if you think mother in the first clause becomes father, in the first clause become mothers. Fingers in the first clause becomes palms. And we see another example of this in the second tercet. To separate lands, to separate hemispheres. So there is this not direct repetition, but what we would call syntactic repetition or syntactic parallelism. The repetition of word order and structures, sentence structures. And this syntactic parallelism could also be seen to quite subtly and quite cleverly embody ideas about genetic duplication. That the structures are repeated and duplicated, but the words within them subtly change. Again, almost as if, as with genetic inheritance, we may share very similar aspects of genetics when it's inherited from our parents, but we still have our own individual identity. Now, I hope that you've appreciated this quick run through of genetics, and good luck with the rest of your studying.